I'm pleased this afternoon to introduce our next speaker, Professor Joseph Gahn, Associate Professor of Psychology and American Culture at the University of Michigan. Professor Gahn is a citizen of the Gros Ventre tribal nation of Montana. He examines cultural influences on mental health status, as well as the intersection of evidence-based practice and cultural competence in mental health services. His many publications explore the cultural psychology of self-identity, personhood, and social relations in Indigenous community settings with regard to mental health. He's particularly attentive to therapeutic interventions that include Indigenous and Western systems of knowledge. Among other honors, Professor Gahn was named a Guggenheim Fellow in 2014. Professor Gahn, I look forward to your paper, Historical Trauma as the Legacy of Genocide in American Indian Communities, Complications and Critiques.
Thanks for that warm introduction. One point of clarification is, as a psychologist, we don't give papers. We actually do PowerPoint presentations, and it's interesting to participate in multidisciplinary venues where you get the range of presentation styles. So anthropologists and historians typically do papers, but some of us in other disciplines tend to talk more through our presentations. So let me begin doing that, if you will. I took the invitation to participate in this symposium as an opportunity to consider the question of genocide against Native Americans. Now, there's other ways to read such invitations. You might read it, for example, as an opportunity to advance the cause, whatever the cause might be in one form or another. But I'm going to say that perhaps in some respects, I'm going to stop to really consider this question in what I have to say today. So, opening up with the question, genocide against Native Americans, there's a few things that I'll just point out briefly as an opportunity to unpack some of these assumptions. Obviously, this statement ends in a question mark. Question mark signals that this is something that's open for interpretation or debate. It also references a group designation, Native Americans, which as an ethno-racial category glosses remarkable diversity. And of course, the term genocide appears quite prominently, and it leads us to wonder how best to define and apply this term, given various historical reformulations in its meaning over time. You heard that I'm a psychologist. Most people think couches, therapy, that sort of thing. That's not what I do. I'm an academic psychologist. Although I should say I have clinical training, and all of my work involves community engagement, typically with Indigenous communities and populations. And because of that engagement, I undertake cultural analysis of various sorts. I look more like an anthropologist than most psychologists do. And in that regard, I've been a member of AAA since I was a graduate student. My research sits at this intersection of culture and mental health, and it's quite interested, of course, then in Indigenous psychologies, and also in the kinds of interventions we might develop cross-culturally to address Native distress in culturally consonant terms. I want to tell you briefly, in moving to my attempt to answer this question, a bit of a story then about how my interests and investigations as an American Indian psychologist have led me to think about this workshop question. So it's not something that psychologists think about that often. And I don't know of any other psychologists who've ever invited to talk to genocide scholars in the couple of opportunities that I have. Let me start then by characterizing this very important concept of Indigenous historical trauma. In my work, in considering rampant rates of psychological and psychiatric distress in American Indian communities, I've characterized what I call the Post-Colonial Predicament for American Indian mental health. You'll notice I have the term post in parentheses there because it's debatable to what degree Indian country is in fact post-colonial or still colonial. There are arguments on both sides of that. But in any case, what I call this post-colonial predicament stems from the fact that on one hand we have very urgent community mental health needs. That is, we live typically in impoverished, high-risk settings, and we have documented disparities in our mental health status as a result of that. This falls particularly within the realm of addictions, suicide, and the sequelae of violence and trauma of various sorts. So on the one hand, we have these community needs, but on the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer are actually pretty incongruent with helping to meet those needs. So one early interviewee I talked to back at the beginning of my career characterized going to the Indian Health Service mental health clinic as an opportunity to invite white psychiatrists to, quote, brainwash me forever, so I can be like a white man. So he recognized that the mental health endeavor is itself a cultural transaction, one that might involve a form of implicit Western cultural proselytization, that therapists might be missionaries for a new millennium, if you will, when it comes to Indian communities. And this concern about incongruence of clinical services for mental health problems has been attested to by community anecdote of various sorts and research evidence. And in fact, the evidence I have in mind has considered health-seeking preferences among Indian communities about what to do in times of distress, in which mental health professionals rank quite low on the list compared to elders, family members, trusted members of the community, and so on. So this predicament actually confronts behavioral health researchers and practitioners throughout Indian country, and one attempt to address these issues has emerged as this discourse of historical trauma. Historical trauma really entered the published scientific literature in the mid-1990s. We have a psychologist named Eduardo Duran, who has written extensively about what he characterizes as the soul wound, which is said to be an injury caused by colonization, which then is passed down the generations and leads to a great deal of risk and distress in subsequent native lives. Similarly, the social work researcher Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, Lakota woman, has characterized historical trauma to capture identical ideas. There's been subsequent refinements and elaborations of these terms. It actually has been pretty heavily promoted by a handful of very influential Native health scientists and professionals. And so historical trauma is now, as a concept, increasingly ubiquitous within Indigenous communities. There's really nowhere you can go in the United States, or in Canada, or in New Zealand, or in Australia where you're not going to hear the term historical trauma. The purpose of historical trauma, as these people started to theorize it, was to accomplish a few what looked and seemed to me to be appropriate emancipatory efforts. I included a couple of these posters. I think they're kind of humorous in one sense. I think the other thing I'm doing with that is that we're talking about very difficult things. We're talking about tragedy of all sorts. The problem for Indian populations is that there's a trope of tragedy. We have been tragedized in every conceivable way, every news story, etc. So sometimes I think it's helpful to counterbalance some of that tragedy with a bit of irony. So you're going to see a few of these throughout. The purpose of historical trauma, in one sense, was to contextualize, historicize, and politicize community health disparities, to try to stigmatize the behavioral health conditions that erupt in our communities, to counter the personal demoralization through collectivized understanding and action as a result, and in the process to legitimate traditional cultural and spiritual practices and processes as therapeutically beneficial. So historical trauma has some good things going for it. It really represents a blending of two existing concepts or constructs: historical oppression, which we all have, and psychological trauma, which sort of has been around for a long time in psychology, but which was really cemented within psychiatric nomenclature with the development of the DSM-3, the Bible of Psychiatric Nosology in 1980, with the inclusion, really introduction, of post-traumatic stress disorder. So psychological trauma, historical oppression come together in this term, historical trauma. And there's what I describe as the 4 C's of Indigenous historical trauma as this construct has been elaborated. First, it comes from colonial injury, perpetration by European or Euro-American groups against subject Indigenous populations. It is collectively experienced. It's not about one individual person's, but an entire group of people, community of people's experiences. It is cumulatively escalating. That is, there's been assault and assault and assault of various sorts, and it's like a snowball in moving through the snow. It gathers and gathers, becomes bigger and more formidable over time. Finally, it's cross-generationally transmitted. That there's, in keeping with therapeutic knowledge about the secondary transmission of trauma in Holocaust survivors to their offspring, there's this idea that some kind of risk or vulnerability is passed down the generations. That independent of the traumatic experiences of offspring, they are at greater risk for mental health problems as a function of their ancestors' experiences of traumas of various sorts. So what to say about historical trauma, which of course is not really the focus of this symposium, but I want to tell you some things I think about before moving on to discuss genocide proper. First of all, historical trauma started and remains grounded in the healthcare professions. So the domain of health, we have to accept, sets clear limits on the emancipatory possibilities of historical trauma. Health and healthcare and health discourse tends to be individuating. It tends to isolate individuals and to focus attention on changing people, individual person by person, as opposed to thinking about groups and so on. It tends to be, as I say, secondly, focused on therapeutic activity. Often in indigenous communities, this is described as healing. And it's interesting to point out here, I think that the pursuit of healing and the pursuit of justice might be fundamentally different endeavors and actually work with different logics. So what does it mean that historical trauma remains really fundamentally yoked to healing? It marks indigenous identity as fragile, wounded, and at risk. That is, what it means to be indigenous has come to signify a kind of biopsychosocial vulnerability, using in a public health term of social determinants of health, for all indigenous people who've suffered from historical trauma, because we've all suffered from colonization. Which gets to this last point, that historical trauma tends to essentialize very diverse indigenous experiences. The notion of essentialism, of course, has to do with the idea that indigenous people have intrinsic and durable essences that render us fundamentally alike, and, as a group, fundamentally different than non-indigenous peoples. And colonization history and the way we experience historical trauma is one instance of that. These similarities therefore emerge in part from shared histories that are also fundamentally the same for this to have worked in this way. But I think the counter to this kind of historical gloss might be some micro-historical analysis, which I'm going to attempt in a bit. Let me start then by, or conclude this section by talking about the importance of genocide. When the proponents of indigenous historical trauma explain where historical trauma comes from, it has to do with a range of colonial experiences, but genocide is the prototype. It's offered as the main way that historical trauma was inaugurated and percolates in our communities, and it's invoked by all the proponents of historical trauma. Specifically, this literature regularly advances the sweeping assertion that indigenous historical trauma originates from tribal experiences of genocide as historically perpetrated against Native peoples by European settler populations. Quote, "What was done to indigenous people in the Americas had all the characteristics of genocide and evoked similar responses to trauma that researchers observed not only in people who survived genocide, but also in their children and grandchildren," end quote, wrote Wesley Eskimo and Smolewski in 2004. According to Evans Campbell in 2008, quote, "These predisposing events are not only human initiated and intentional, but also fall under the category of genocide, for example, physical, cultural, or ethnocide, making them particularly devastating," end quote. Les Whitbeck and colleagues, 2004, invoked, quote, "more than 400 years of genocide, ethnic cleansing and forced acculturation," end quote, yielding what Duran and Duran in 1995 identified as, quote, "post-traumatic stress disorder as a consequence of the devastating effects of genocide perpetrated by the U.S. government," end quote. Braveheart and De Bruyne in 1998 wrote, quote, "Like the transfer of trauma to descendants from Holocaust survivors, the genocide of American Indians reverberates across generations," end quote, all as a result of colonial, quote, "policies of genocide and ethnocide," end quote, according to Walters and Simony in 2002. So genocide has been completely invoked by every major proponent of indigenous historical trauma. And it's attributed in general to indigenous peoples. There's no saying, well, the Lakota who survived Wounded Knee have historical trauma, but the neighbors who didn't don't have it. It's a discourse that sweeps all indigenous peoples under its mantle. And it reinforces certain essentialist binaries. And the main binary you can imagine would be white perpetration and indigenous victimization. Now, of course, it's the job of critical scholarship to complicate simplistic white hat, black hat binaries. So that's what I intend to do next. published an article called Reconsidering American Indian Historical Trauma. And in it, I attempted to assess this construct of historical trauma based on a specific, perhaps you might say, micro-historical example. It was an effort to try to make sense of violence in the 19th century Northern Plains, where my people lived for centuries prior to the reservation era. And I drew, in particular, on some work of an anthropologist named Alfred Kroeber, who visited my reservation, Fort Belknap Reservation in north central Montana in 1901, and prepared a monograph associated with our people called The Ethnology of the Gros Ventre. And in this monograph, he has a section called War Experiences of Individuals. There are 3 accounts that he recorded in this section, including an important narrative by a Gros Ventre called Watches All. Watches All is interesting for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that she was a Gros Ventre woman who lived primarily during the second half of the 19th century. She was the only woman to recount a war experience in Kroeber's monograph. She was interviewed, as I say, in 1901 by Kroeber in English on the Fort Belknap Reservation as part of his field work, anthropological field work. At the time of this event of narration, she was in her 60s, which means that at the time of the narrative events, which occurred in 1867-68, she was around 30. The narrative that Kroeber recorded from Watches All is interesting on several fronts, one of which is how do we read it? It's placed in Kroeber's monograph alongside other, what we might call coup tales, a recognized oral genre among Plains peoples. Whether to read it exactly that way is a little unclear, but it's interesting to try and think of it that way. The account pertains to Watches All experience during the Gros Ventre Piegan War of 1868. Piegan, Southern Blackfeet, Scotty Pecunny, who now live on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. The Gros Ventres were allies with the Blackfeet for most of the historical period until 1861, when they had a falling out and the Blackfeet became our enemies. And it was really 1868 when this erupted in a major way. In fact, nearly 300 Gros Ventres were slaughtered near the Cypress Hills, and Watches All was part of that endeavor. So, Watches All rode to war with Gros Ventre and Crow allies to the Cypress Hills to make war on the Piegan, and were routed. Watches All fled, was captured, taken back to the Piegan camps, where she lived for many months under circumstances of great duress, finally escaped. It was really a year-long ordeal before Watches All made it back to the Gros Ventre camps and her own kin. She experienced, as you might imagine, all kinds of violence during this particular ordeal. So, of course, she rode with the Gros Ventres and Crows to war against the Piegan. They came upon a Piegan couple who they murdered. They then went further and found a couple more and killed those people. Suddenly the Piegan were aware that the party was advancing and started to retaliate. And then there was this rout and this retreat in which Watches All jumped on a horse and fled, but the horse stepped on its own reins and got struck, and a Piegan man came by, bashed her on the head, and threw her off the horse. Another Piegan man came and took off her necklace, and later when they took her back to camp through a trail of dead Gros Ventre bodies, they disputed over who owned her as a result of this captivity. One man won, the other man resolved to kill her. Captives were really mistreated. So many people in the camp came, particularly during that first day, and beat her. One man struck her in the head with a gun to the degree that she said she almost was killed. She then was the wife, is the term she used, for one particular warrior, the one who made claim for having captured her. And this man would protect her from all kinds of people in the camp who wanted to kill her. At some point, presumably, it got too burdensome to maintain that protection, so he, quote, sold her to a different man, where she was kept for some time. One might wonder to what degree sexual coercion of one kind or another was part of her responsibility. She does not make reference to that, and we don't know that. But it's something that one might wonder, certainly, in this context where she was in the Piegan camp and a wife to these two men in particular over the course of many months. At some point, she decided, along with her mother, who was in the camp with her, to escape. So at night, they stole away, and here they are in the middle of Montana with no horses and no supplies, and trying to figure out a way to get home. So they traverse forests and woods, they walk around a sleeping grizzly bear, they get to the Missouri River where they see boats going up. At one point, Watches All reports, her mother decides to sell her to the white soldier camp. And Watches All resists with a knife, and so her mother fails to sell her to the soldiers. They continue downstream to the Missouri, where they are able to cross to a store and fort, where they were received by some Crow women and one Gros-Ventre woman and treated well. They lived there for a time, they were fed, they were taken care of, and they decided to go out and forage for, I forget if it was berries or what, but they were very concerned about the Lakota attacking. They went out anyway, and sure enough, the Lakota warrior took after them. They were managed to escape, but this same Lakota warrior killed a white man who had been sawing some wood nearby, and she reported that his body was burnt up, so only his legs were left in the fire after this murder. Time goes by, but finally she gets graduate Bull Lodge, a very important leader of Gros-Ventre society, and gets it back to the camps and is able to be reunited with her kin. So this is the kind of violence that was not so unusual, pretty common in the 19th century Northern Plains context. And it's important to understand the broader context. Before I tell you about that, I want to say that in this article, the question I'm asking about historical trauma is the degree to which Watchesall's captivity really counts as historical trauma by the criteria that the proponents of this concept have described. And I ask 4 clarifying questions in an effort to address that question, and I offer 4 complicating answers that I'm not going to go into really today, except to point out that one of those questions is the question of historical oppression by Europeans in this specific context. Because historical trauma, or the first and most important 4C, is about colonial injury. It's about perpetration and victimization, European perpetration, and and native victimization. So, we have to understand a bit of the context here. Incredible violence during this period of time, in part fueled by the fur trade, in which you have French and a French meeting and allying with Crees and Assiniboines from the Canadian area, moving west, and they are the middlemen, the brokers, the controller of access to the fur traders, and therefore they are well armed. Guns come westward through them. At the same time, you've got the Spaniards and the horse coming up from the New Mexico area and through the Plateau tribes, which are coming really from the east to the same locale. So you have an imbalance of power, fueled by horses coming from one direction and guns coming from the other direction. And you have a contestation over controlled territory for the road trade. So it's all tied to economics. It's all tied to the system of trade associated with first the beaver and of course later the buffalo trade. And so one question we might ask here then is, to what degree is deadly intertribal warfare in this instance or in this context merely or even primarily European or Euro-American subjugation? There's a sense in which the violence going on is native on native violence. It's influenced by these imbalances in power and the trade, but there are no Europeans waging violence of this sort at this time. What we need to, I think, recognize that the disastrous effects of colonial disruption can extend, and did extend in this context, well beyond European settler presence or even intent. Now, there's no claim here that the Europeans wanted these tribes to fight it out necessarily. There was no sense that they wanted them all exterminated. They needed them, actually, to have the robes. They were the ones who provided that important economic benefit in exchange for various goods that they wanted. So my point in that analysis was to describe the fact that I think that easy distinctions between colonial and non-colonial perpetration of oppression start to evaporate under contexts like this, which are subtle and nuanced in many forms. So given the history just described, what are we to make of sweeping attributions of genocide that are regularly invoked in this discourse of Indigenous historical trauma? And I'm going to now stop talking about historical trauma so much and just really move or return it back to the workshop question, genocide against Native Americans, question mark. Given that my people never fought the U.S. Army, given that my people's only experience of mass killing at the hands of others was 400 of us dead in the Sweetgrass Hills in 1834 by Allied Crees and Assiniboines, or 300 dead in 1868 at the hands of the Piegan and the Cypress Hills. So, addressing the workshop question. Fortunately, I have the benefit of coming after several other presenters which have done some of this work for me. Obviously, the answer to this workshop question depends a lot on one's conception of genocide. We've heard from Dr. Alvarez about the coining of Lemkin's neologism, genocide, which as neologism has to find traction, but of course genocide means extermination of a people. So there's some presumed limitation of what it can mean just based on how the words are put together. And we want to take stock of, I think, a cognitive style, the kinds of things psychologists care about, of how humans classify phenomena. So, two different classification styles that I think are relevant here are what are called criterial classification and prototypical classification. Criterial classification involves the development of necessary and sufficient conditions by which you decide whether some entity is a member of a class or not. So you could say birds, the class of birds, can be defined by criterial features. They have feathers, they take flight, they lay eggs, what have you. And the definitional task at hand is simply going through and applying these criteria. Yes, okay, robins and sparrows and on you go. But ostriches, no. Penguins, no. So they don't meet those criteria. In contrast, you have a different approach to classification called prototypical classification. This has to do with more of a spatial sense of classification, in which there's a central prototype for what is to be classed, with marginal examples that depart from the exemplary instances at the center, and they might be arranged spatially more toward the margins of the class. So a robin's dead center of the prototypical form of classification. Ostriches and penguins can still be in, but there might be way around the boundary, wherever that boundary is drawn. And the point here is that wherever you draw those boundaries, they're sort of inherently arbitrary and fuzzy, which leads really to this question of what kind of classification strategy do we mean to apply to a term like genocide? There are real challenges with the definition. As people have said, it's necessary for evaluating claims that you have a definition and you know how to apply it. But it's ambiguous, as Professor Alvarez again just said, in light of arbitrary criteria and contestable boundaries. And of course, it's been moving. It hasn't stayed still. It's contingent also on historical reformulations in this concept. And I'll point out another snag here, which has to do with qualifications of this term. I believe someone this morning talked about that. It's colonial genocide, it's cultural genocide. It's so rare, particularly with reference to indigenous peoples, that anyone says genocide, full stop, period, end of sentence. That qualification means something in terms of the sense of it not applying in its fullest, most clear sense. So I'm just going to do two different variations of how we might proceed. We've got these classic conceptions of genocide, the old school stuff that I think people are interested in perhaps revising, expanding, or in some way revisiting in symposia like this. Genocide was attempted or enacted mass murder. Pretty simple and straightforward definition. Jones elaborated on such a definition in his 2011 book, in which he wrote, in reviewing these definitions, Jones highlighted 6 key domains that most definitions of genocide appear to address in various fashion: agents, victims, goals, scale, strategies, and intent. For example, according to Jones, agents are often identified as state authorities and the victims as social minorities. The goals typically include the destruction of the targeted group. The scale varies as to whether total or partial eradication is attempted. And the strategies refer to either direct or indirect actions in all of their specificity. Finally, Jones cited a virtual consensus among scholars that such actions must be undertaken with purposeful and deliberate intent. Obviously, variations across these domains are what lead to different definitions of genocide. And of course, in the classic conception of genocide, it's almost never applied to Native Americans or indigenous peoples in North America, as Professor Blackhawk told us last night. In fact, if you take the definitive 15-volume Smithsonian Handbook of the American Indian, I looked in volume 4 in particular, the volume dedicated to Indian-white relations, 838 pages. It's a big book. It contains only one reference to genocide, and that reference is in the chapter about Indian representations in English literature. Usually not applied to indigenous populations. Of course, we have recent reformulations, and there are several of these over time, but I'm just going to focus on this one that I'm most familiar with from 2014, this book, Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America. Colonial genocide has an interesting reformulation that I think Professor Alvarez also just touched on, which has to do with expanding our notion of genocide to other forms of experience that depart from that more classic sense. That is, it's associated with a logic of dispossession, with the idea being that whether mass murder is ever executed or coordinated or planned in detail, it is always the implicit end state of this logic of dispossession. And therefore, colonialism, so the argument goes, is genocidal, because that's where it always could go if things don't end up working relative to dispossession. Therefore, it's expressed through the colonial project implicitly, and also the expansion depends on this notion of peoplehood, that it's about not just death or physical death or privileging of the biological as part of the critique, but in fact is about the extinguishing of peoplehood, which can happen in all kinds of ways that don't necessarily involve physical death. Therefore, it is attributable even in the absence of murder. And in this book, you can read chapters in which the extension of this concept to related impacts are quite intriguing. So bison hunting, the genocide of the buffalo is one of the chapters in this book. Or the residential schools, of course, that this was a form of genocide, predicated, of course, on the UN Genocide Convention's section about removing children, for example. My preference, which I'll rationalize for you in just a minute, is that I really think that there is an argument to be made for reserving use of this term genocide for collective intent and coordinated action in pursuit of, not necessarily successful pursuit, but in pursuit of a comprehensive elimination by a dominant group. It's pretty classic. Now, why do I think that? There are a few reasons. One has to do with the advantages of a colloquialism. You start off with a neologism, a new word, no one knows what it means, that word, as Albert's talked about again, has arrived. Everyone knows what this word means. You can put it together, genocide, extermination of a people. You can look up the dictionary definition, you go to Google, look it up, right? It means the destruction of a people. There's a sense in which its meaning has common currency across a wide swath of people. So there's something to be said for the triumph of coining a neologism and then having it arrive to a meaning that people understand and know. Tinkering with it, expanding it, altering it, comes with some cost, therefore, in terms of having the word retain some meaning that people can use in some reliable fashion. That's not a huge reason, it's one. A bigger reason, I think, is what I'm referring to here as the trade-off between this term's descriptive and evaluative functions. That it has descriptive functions, it has evaluative functions, and these are in tension. So what do I mean by this? Well, I had opportunity in the conference that led up to the publication of this colonial genocide book to hear the co-chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Justice Murray Sinclair in Canada, talk about the brouhaha that ensued when he reasoned aloud to some media that he's hearing from a lot of survivors who are testifying about the abuses of the residential schools, that they feel like this is genocidal. And the media took off, and there was a huge explosion of interest and controversy in Canada throughout the time that Justice Sinclair was considering whether or not to label the residential school legacy as genocidal. And in fact, in the end, now that the report is done, he did, although he qualified it, cultural genocide. In any case, what was interesting to me about his report of this brouhaha was that he said, and during this process, I have a very good friend. This friend is a survivor of the Buchenwald concentration camp. And while this was going on, I felt like I had to call my friend. So I called him, and I apologized to my friend. I said, I hope you're not offended. I didn't mean to take anything away from someone such as yourself who was a victim of, quote, true genocide. So he's recognizing, he feels like there's something amiss in his application of this term, genocide, to the residential schooling context when there are others who have been victimized by true genocide. And I think this is what led me to appreciate this necessary trade-off between the terms descriptive and evaluative functions. The descriptive function just has to do with what are we referring to? What is its definition? It's referential designation of circumstances that qualify by its definition. You apply the definition, so it's a referential function, descriptive function. It means this, and it applies to this instance. Its evaluative function is more about the moral appraisal of a certain form of exceptionally unconscionable behavior. It's been plucked out to mean, as Professor Alvarez also said, the most extreme form, crime of crimes, those sorts of things. And so the effort to engage in conceptual expansion of this term, in my view, seeks to exploit the evaluative function to get the moral fire by application of the term, by relaxing its descriptive function to be much more inclusive. And that's why you might end up with some ridiculous things like Planned Parenthood is genocidal, because people want the evaluative function at the expense of the descriptive function. So, descriptive and evaluative functions in tension. Of course, this rhetorical strategy of exploiting the evaluative while relaxing the descriptive runs the risk of yielding the opposite result. That is, you end up with a lot of people who will balk immediately and dismiss this claim altogether as merely rhetorical, as I think what's happened in Canada in the wake of this description. So, depending on what your goal is in harnessing and exploiting the evaluative function at the expense of the descriptive function, we might be pragmatic about the degree to which it is either successful or not. It is meant, of course, to identify the extreme end of the moral continuum, the crime of crimes. This is in some ways really the only way, I think, to maintain the crucial moral distinction between the Indian killer, the buffalo hide hunter, and the schoolmarm, all of whom, by some definitions of genocide, are said to be guilty of this crime of crimes. And so, I think that there is some warranted reason to preserve the term genocide for this extreme end of the moral continuum. And if we don't, if we want to expand it, then I believe we will need a new neologism to capture that extreme end, the crime of crimes, because there's a reason for wanting to designate that in clear and articulate fashion in human affairs. So, finally, let me answer the question. Yes, there were native genocides, plural. But colonization, I would argue, was intermittently, rather than fundamentally, genocide. That genocide was really one among several patterns of colonial violence. For example, I refer you to the reviews of David Standard's 1992 book, American Holocaust, by noted historians like J.H. Eliot in the New York Review of Books, or Richard White in the New Republic. My view is that their appraisal of Standard's book, Standard making the claim that the entire process is genocidal, of course, 1992, the centennial of the arrival of Columbus, White wrote, quote, "Standard takes the horrible and seeks to make it worse." The idea that these scholars and reviewers had was that it takes a manslaughter case and tries to get a verdict of murder. I think these analyses have weathered pretty well in the ensuing 25 years. And I think if you're interested, you might take a look at those. The point is that there were other patterns associated with colonization that were not genocidal proper. So I just told you about my own people's context in the history of the 19th century, in which the kind of violence going on doesn't fall so well into the term of genocide as we typically understand it. Or take the French and Indian Wars, which waged for a great deal of time with allies on both sides. Or take Robbie Etheridge's colonial shatter zone in the southeast, which was referenced earlier today as well, in which the English arrived, settled in Carolinas, made allies with surrounding native peoples, and those peoples raided the southeast and destroyed those communities and enslaved on behalf of the English in exchange for whatever. Off they go to the West Indies as slaves. Genocide? It's complicated and nuanced in a way that I'm not sure that term really captures. And I say here there are other terms that designate these other forms of violence. So we heard a bunch of those just in Professor Simpson's talk. I think it was a fantastic way to rhetorically capture the incredible injustice, violence, and so on, that doesn't necessarily need to invoke or center genocide, crimes against humanity, human rights violations, ethnic cleansing, colonial massacres, forced assimilation. Professor Alvarez, war crimes, mass atrocities, ethnic violence, inhumane acts. We have a rich vocabulary. We have talented rhetorical creators who can come up with language that can do what we need to do without trading the descriptive functions of genocide for the evaluative functions. And so, I conclude that genocide was the exception rather than the rule in colonial Native America, and that all of humanity has a stake in preserving this term for reference to group-based mass murder. I've written a lot about this and other stuff, but if you'd like to see, you can go to this website. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Questions?
Or better yet, comments.
I can speak on that. I would imagine that your analysis is, at least in some quarters, seem to be quite controversial given the amount of emotional investment people have in historical trauma, for example. And I'm curious what the responses or pushback has been to the kind of argument you presented today, and what kinds of constructive conversations hopefully are emerging out of that.
Yeah, my spouse is a professor of African American studies, and among other things, she's a historian. But I very much envy her connection to a scholarly community of diverse academics, African Americans, who've had an intellectual culture and development for a century and more. I mean, you think of Du Bois as just one inaugural piece of that tradition. American Indian Studies is a lot younger than that, way, way younger. So in my experience, we are much less reluctant yet to engage in spirited public disagreement with each other. So it either is so upsetting to people that you get ad hominem attacks, or it's politely ignored and then talked about maybe behind your back. But I've not had very much opportunity to actually have exchange, other than maybe at a bar over a drink or something, which is not the same, I suppose, as an engaged, thoughtful. But there's no question that many things that I have to say are considered controversial. Part of that is my own penchant for kind of provocation, but part of that is also my conception of what it means to be a scholar. That I think as a scholar, as scholars, especially scholars of color, that we have an obligation to trouble taken for granted assumptions, and that Indian communities are as likely to benefit from that as any other community. So I guess that's my response.
Thank you for your talk, and thank you for your work. It's so important, psychologists and mental health for our people. So when you talk about Native genocides and you talk about humanity having a stake in preserving the term to group-based murder, are you equating Native genocides as massacres? Is that how you're defining it?
No, I think I would preserve the term massacre as not necessarily meeting the kind of more classic criteria of genocide. I think Ben Madley, for example, is a historian who's got some of the best evidence and argument for genocides occurring in California and in Oregon, for example. But what's interesting to me is you take Sand Creek, which we just heard about. And there's a historian named Brian Rensick who's written about Sand Creek and tried to figure out whether Sand Creek massacre should be construed as genocide or not. And this is, as Professor Alvarez said, a pretty classic, iconic campaign of death and destruction and mayhem that reeks to heaven. But when Professor Rensick looks into this, he finds that actually, because of very deep divided opinion about Indian affairs at the time, and a public that was attuned to and ready to zero in on Indian atrocities for and against, that historians cannot separate the wheat from the chaff, that actually historical analysis gets blocked by the fact that the facts were in question from the moment the massacre occurred, and that there were different competing perspectives depending on where you were coming from in that event. So I think if something like Sand Creek is in question, suggests that something like Wounded Knee is in question, it may mean that some of these questions are lost to history. But not all of them. Again, the genocides that I think there is good evidence for are probably because they happened so late, perhaps, California and Oregon.
Jill, it was such a rich, critical account of things, and I appreciate it very much. I'm going to be thinking about this for a while. Two things I want to ask you. One is the preservation of the term in your overall argument, and the preservation of the term for, as you say, the most extreme cases. And underneath that, I see, or I sense, or I suspect a moving, perhaps, target, possibility of a moving bar. And of course, I guess I want to press on, is that exemplary case for you the Jewish Holocaust? Is it the Armenian Genocide? Is it the specificity of we heard about, I think, the Pomo massacre this morning? Is so I'm imagining that there is an case for you. Or I want to ask you, is there an case for you? And does that not move? Or can it move? So that's my first sort of question or invitation to unpack with you, to press you on a bit. And then the other thing I'm thinking about is Carl's response to you this morning, which I think is also, I want to revisit, is, he said that genocide should be unqualified and unmodified because the aggregate of the violence, the aggregate of the loss over time constitutes something so, and Carl, here I'm speaking for you, but constitutes something so demographically significant that it should be called genocide. So, and Carl, as we know, is a very careful historian, and I want to ask you about that. And I mean, I'm all myself, obviously, the mode of address that I chose this morning and the way I do analysis is very, very different, right? And I do not use terms like this all the time for different reasons. But I do think, this is important language to take out and work with at times as well. So those are my two invitational questions or presses. And then eventually I just want to talk to you about historical trauma and its evacuation of politics from the scene of justice work. So, and I saw that, or I heard that in the first half of your talk, and I think it is a profound problem myself, to offer therapy instead of land. So, but that's another thing. I just want to put that out there.
Thank you. Terrific. It's hard for me to imagine that the Holocaust isn't the error case for all of us when it comes to genocide. Right? It's, some have said, hegemonic in that regard. But it's not so hegemonic that we can't imagine the Yukis, the Modocs, right? I mean, even with these classic criteria, they seem to meet it. So I'm not as worried about that. It does mean that it's in Indigenous North America that they're probably, because of the difficulty of historical reformulation, there may not be opportunity to find a whole bunch more. But why can't, it's horrible enough. I mean, do we really have to, what is, I guess, the determination to find a verdict of genocide in every instance of horrific violence in the history of Native North America is something I don't exactly understand, outside of the understanding that kind of suggests itself, which is about moral rhetoric, and it's about prosecuting a certain form of identity politics that I take to be, in some ways, antithetical to scholarship. So, I don't think it always is, but there's a certain brand of it that I think is. So that's the case issue. I think also the aggregation of violence and loss, well, that's interesting because Professor Jack, we did talk about the aggregation of violence and loss. Of course, violence is different than loss, right? We're talking 90%, that's what historians estimate, the last time I checked, of Native peoples died from disease, infectious diseases. Now, I appreciate the point about venereal disease and other kinds of disease. Of course, we have Jeffrey Amherst and the smallpox blanket. But you go back to my people's history on the Northern Plains, and you're talking about epidemic after epidemic, measles, flu, smallpox, in which massive numbers of our people die, and it's not clear that anyone at that time, in the fur trade days, really was bent on our being depopulated from that part of the world. In fact, they depended on us and other native peoples for the economy that they were engaged in. So I'm not sure what to make of simple arguments about the aggregation. And I guess I'd refer you to Richard White again, who has a really nice analysis of Standard. I mean, first of all, if you haven't read Standard's book, I think you really want to read that, because, you know, whether or not we think that he's over the top in terms of his allegations of genocide, to find in concentrated step-by-step fashion the horrors that he reports should cure anyone of an inoculation to the horrors of colonization. So whether we call them genocide or not, Standard's book is a must-read. But I think that put in perspective with White and with Elliott and with others, it's pretty quite illuminating, and I don't find reason to disagree with White at this point, 25 years later. Yes, let's talk historical trauma at some point, because I do think it involves the evacuation of politics to a large degree, which is my biggest concern. I wonder if instead of being traumatized, we thought of ourselves as being, well, you talk about grief, what about bereavement? That's a kind of different set of things. Or what about aggrieved? It's a little different. What about resistant? What about resilient? Right? There are different frames to place around colonized experiences that don't necessarily essentialize our subject position as being merely traumatized by colonization. There's a lot of reactions that we have and do and have had to colonization. That's not just being victimized. Who else?
Oh, again? All right.
Do I have your consent? The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Joe, is the language of genocide itself. All right, so you're problematizing the descriptive, and also you're saying almost ascriptive elements of it, like it's ascribing something, evaluating. Okay, and the evaluative dimension of it.
Or ascriptive, yeah.
Yeah. So, and you want to preserve it, but we're also hearing these sort of really careful critiques of the intentionality and the legal basis, the legal intentionality of the term, which is, I think, forcing analysis in a particular way. And I wanted to invite you to tell us something about that. Is that part of the problem then of this flattening? Because you're saying, I'm a good social scientist. I want us to pay attention to the facts, and the facts are not always there. You even said lost to history. My God, I almost rolled over on that one. But I mean, because I think the truth is always out there. It's just we'll find it eventually. But so I'm wondering about that legal intentionality and how that is constraining the kind of analysis I think you're calling for.
Yeah.
Or am I in the right neighborhood with this?
No, I think that's a more question, because it was put on the table earlier about the degree to which intent ought to be, given that there's limited opportunity to document it. And yet, if you're talking about the extreme end of a moral continuum of group-based violence, how can you evacuate intent? If it's not intentional, it's a different order of thing. And so the claim that it's too hard to document, I don't know what we do with that. It's just because it is meant to capture the crime of crimes. And certainly in a legal context, intent is all about intent and establishing intent. And interestingly, people have ways of doing it. Even though none of us can look inside someone's mind and see what exactly they were thinking, right? So I guess I find myself resistant to the idea that intent should just be discharged because it's too hard to gather. And I think there are some other concepts at the heart of the effort to expand the concept that are a little bit fuzzy as well. So, peoplehood. You know, that sounds nice, right? That yes, there are a lot of ways to break apart people, to destroy someone's sense of peoplehood. I think. I mean, there certainly can be attempts, but you know, Jewish people provide examples in lots of ways around this. So, Jewish people have been reconstituted despite diasporas by empires for thousands of years, efforts to destroy their people had failed and failed and failed. And then on the other end of the spectrum, what does it mean to destroy a people? Anyway, I've just not heard very clearly articulated sense of what peoplehood precisely is, how it can be destroyed, the conditions under which it could survive and be reconstituted, since it seems like those happen sometimes. That happens sometimes. Not just a fuzzy concept that I don't know how far that can be pushed before it starts to dissolve. Sometimes these things are talked about as if people's group societies are like organisms, as opposed to a collection of a bunch of individuals in which there is no group of people who mastermind action and everyone follows suit, but that the social life becomes self-organizing in a way that no one could have predicted based on everyone's and that happens in colonial violence of all kinds as well. No one had to orchestrate it. It comes together in eruptions. Not that there aren't mindsets, not that there aren't discourses, but that make it possible, but it's a little different than someone who intended something coordinating something. Anyway. Yes?
I want to return to this question of historical trauma
Yeah.
and to what you said about the role of language therapy.
Or maybe both.
That's exactly where I was going, yes. So I wanted to bring some of my historical work to this as a historian of the Holocaust. So the perspective of large segments of the Holocaust survivor community would be, yes, this may have made me crazy. Yes, I may need therapy. Yes, that is true. But what I want is justice.
Oh, yeah.
So, and more, that this notion of being offered therapy is a way of pathologizing the victim and of weakening and undermining strength. So,
Before you answer, let's get one more question, because this will be the last. If you don't mind doing two together.
Okay, this is actually raising the issue, especially around the evaluative function of the term genocide. And I'd like to throw out sort of an opposite viewpoint and have you comment on it. You were looking a lot at how people in the targeted communities, whether you're talking about colonialism or genocide, whatever that targets them, react or use or shape the use of the term, want the term used. But I think it's also in the US context really important to look at people in the majority society and why it is people don't want to use the term genocide. And what my concern would be, and this debate comes up over the Armenian Genocide in Turkey, whether you use the term or not. It's a very similar kind of debate, which is interesting. It seems to me that even if every Native American scholar and non-Native American scholar who insists on the term genocide, each organization who does the same thing, gave up that term and substituted something else, would still be facing the same problem, which I think you're trying to address, which is denial of whatever happened. So wherever the bar gets moved, there's still going to be denial. And that, to me, seems to be the deeper question. And I think that's why a lot of people try to use the term genocide, because it's a line that they're not willing to give up. Like, if we give up genocide, then we're going to give up mass atrocity, which is then we're going to give up destructive colonialism. And at some point, everything just gets eroded. Maybe we need to draw that line somewhere else besides genocide. That's what you're arguing. But I think we have to really think that there is a line somewhere that we don't want to give up. We don't want to go beyond.
Thanks. Two questions, both interesting and limited time. So let me just start with this one. I would say that it's part of the American narrative in most people's minds that Indians got screwed by the United States, that we've been dispossessed, that we were put on reservations, that we've been mistreated. I actually think that's pretty common. So I don't know if the stakes are quite as you lay them out. I think there would be a lot of resistance to the claim of genocide, but I don't think there would be resistance to the claim that we have been mistreated. The question becomes, what's the end game? What is the goal? Presumably the goal is not simply to get our victimization represented as genocide. That would be symbolic of something, but I don't know what that really concretely and materially matters. What matters is whatever that could translate into. And I wonder, as a strategy, if there's not some more direct way to get there that doesn't falter or get caught up in all of the sideshow about is it genocide, is it not, how do we define this, with regard to whatever it is we want. decolonization, or however people think about it. So that would be my response to that. There's a lot to be said about pathologized identities, therapeutic advocacy, and success. You know, the one thing I guess I'll say very briefly is that Jewish people are in some ways an opportunity to think about the similarities and differences with Indigenous peoples in ways that I think are illuminated. So, of course, Holocaust survivors were colored or deeply, in some cases, scarred by those experiences. But the largest set of evidence and data about their well-being over time suggests that actually a lot of them end up doing much better than you would think, depending on what you think, I guess, but much better than what you'd think over time, later in their lives and so on, than it would be possible for most of us to imagine, having gone through that. And you go to the next generation, or 2 generations, oh my gosh. I mean, Jewish people are thriving in the world. In this country, I mean, Jewish people in the United States are only 3 times as big as Indigenous people in the United States. And yet look at the differential in power and wealth and influence. And I mean, it's astonishing. So I guess I would suggest that it's not historical events per se that can account for those differences. That there's other stuff going on that maybe is more current and right now and structural, and that plays out in our lives and communities in ways that might be where the action is in terms of if we're going to overcome the horrific limitations that Indigenous peoples and communities still find themselves under. More to be said, but I guess that's enough for today, for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but maybe more questions.
I can see you. I know. Yeah, what I heard. Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I know how to pronounce your last name. Tamez. You can say Tamez. That's how it's pronounced in one part of the community, and others say Tamez.
You know, there was a lot of why is it people, like images coming out that college genocide, I would define it over time, but as a standard there, it doesn't matter what you follow, it's still going to get denied. And I really, I mean, knowing my students, Massachusetts, that's a big part of it, yeah.